Hey everyone, welcome to the Narrative Explored video presentation. This quick video, well, not so quick video, will explore narrative theory a little more in depth from the narrative handout. This video is separated into three parts: origins and context, social justice, and intervention. Let's get started.
This segment will be on the origin and context of narrative theory. I understand that we do have a portion of it on our handout, but I think it's really important to talk a little bit more about it and elaborate because of how interdisciplinary in nature narrative therapy is. Narrative therapy really borrows from the arts and humanities, which is something we may not always think about immediately in social work or even consider as part of social work. I think because of the way in which narrative therapy developed in the 1980s, which is sort of new to me, I think this provides a vast array of implications for how social work can continue to develop in the future by using interdisciplinary methods and disciplines. I think that this also suggests that maybe we can look forward to using different epistemologies, cultural theories, and ethnic studies into the practice of social work. So, the origin and context. We know that existentialism is a lot like narrative theory because it incorporates an array of philosophical and sociological theories into a framework for social work practice. Some of the ideas that narrative theory draws from are existentialism, as well as multiculturalism and symbolic interactionism. Narrative theory also relies heavily upon postmodernism and social constructivism, a lot of isms. So I'm going to elaborate on these last two ideas, postmodernism and social constructivism, just a little bit. The reason being is because in social work and as marginalized groups, we learn a lot about power, oppression, and privilege, and how there are dangers of believing and listening only to a single story, or even articulating that single story. Thus, we can find value in understanding the theoretical foundations, as opposed to just jumping into interventions immediately right off the bat, to see how narrative therapy might fit in working with a client or a community. So postmodernism, it's a broad movement that developed in the mid-20th century and continued forward, and narrative theory relies a lot upon the ideas of Michel Foucault. There's this prevailing ideology, or in postmodernism, they posit that there's prevailing ideologies that affect people's perceptions of their worlds. Postmodernism rejects the idea that there's a grand narrative and is against the overgeneralization of people or a person. It also states that personal narratives are reflections of a culture or collective group or a particular context, just as much as narratives are the reflections of lives of individuals. With social constructivism, it's really this idea that there's no one singular objective reality that all people can come together, comprehend, and agree upon. It states that individuals and groups create their own realities and their own social worlds. Our view of reality evolves and shifts over time, much like our identity. One's presumed knowledge about the self and others is wholly subjective and can transform over time. So I think the most interesting and perhaps the most important part of narrative therapy is these aspects and components of language and knowledge that also fall into postmodernist thought and what sociologists talk a lot about. So with language and knowledge, there is this idea that knowledge is power, and language also disseminates knowledge. With language, the words we use to tell a story influences our thoughts, beliefs, and feelings, even towards ourselves and other groups. And with knowledge, it's important to remember that there might be people who are in control of the nature of knowledge, the dissemination of knowledge. And this is done in order to preserve their situations of influence in a culture. So, why is this background so important? It's easy to get wrapped up in a dominant narrative sometimes, or a narrative that's been imposed upon you because it's not always in our direct control. Many times we learn dominant narratives from those who are in control of the nature of knowledge, and this can happen across all levels. When experiencing a trauma response, it may be that a client sees only a specific dominant story, rather than everything else that holistically composes their unique story as an individual or as an individual as part of a collective. And so, with this foundation, we can see that in narrative therapy, just like in the practice of social work overall, individuals are the experts of their own lives. This theory and therapy is really built on empowerment and may have implications for working with specific marginalized groups. I would suggest to the practicing clinician that we educate ourselves on the history and systems that certain groups must endure or face. And history can be considered as a collective narrative. Even though earlier we said that there's no grand narrative, still, just work with me a little bit on that. And one critical thought I have to offer for this is that despite the emergence of philosophical thought and sociological texts that came together to develop this therapy and theory, the importance of storytelling and epistemology centered on our relationship with narratives is not a novel idea developed entirely in the West. It's now widely documented in academia, in particular in the native literary world, that oral storytelling has been a very therapeutic process in which intergenerational systems of knowledge have been transmitted across centuries.
Hey guys, this is Alexandra. I'm going to do this little piece on how narrative is being used all the time, inside of us, outside of us, and how that relates to social movements and social justice. Okay, firstly, I think it's important to say that narrative is being used all the time in ways that are oppressive. We can take a look and notice which narratives come to the forefront through the media, what we learn in schools, what type of knowledge is considered valuable. And we may notice, or not notice, depending on our position, that certain narratives are invisibilized or devalued. We see narrative play out in stereotyping, which informs what the public believes, and policy. We see the erasure of history and people losing access to their ancestral stories, or those stories being devalued, which we call cultural genocide. And we see the power of stigma to silence or make invisible people's narratives. The takeaway is that national and cultural narratives are being promoted all the time that reflect and perpetuate unjust power dynamics and portray inequality as natural. So I know I just said a lot, but now I'm going to show you just 3 ways that people with marginalized identities use narrative to carve out space for themselves and or fight back. Okay. So recentering the self, decentering the dominant paradigm. This is writer Toni Morrison, may she rest in peace, and I'll just let her speak to this. There's no closed captioning, sorry.
I didn't want to speak for Black people. I wanted to speak to and to be among. It's us. So the first thing I had to do was to eliminate the white gaze. Jimmy Baldwin used to talk about that. The little white man that sits on your shoulder and checks out everything you do and say. So to knock him off. And, you're free. Now, I own the world. I mean, I can write about anything. To anyone, for anyone. I don't have to have this white, judgmental eye checking me, editing me, approving of me.
Okay. The next one is remembering histories. I put 2 images here because they represent different things to me. The message on the left is a sign often used in protests against immigration policing. Politicians and media and people in general, white people pretty much, push a narrative that is immigrants are criminals and they don't belong here. So these youth are recalling history to flip the narrative to say, you know, we were here before this line was drawn. We have a natural right to stand on this land, and we do belong here. So that's really powerful. Okay, on the right are radical trans activists Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, because remembering histories is also about celebrating our heroes and honoring, you know, the people who came before us. These two women were street youth in New York City. And one of the things that really interests me about them is that they opened up a home to homeless queer youth, and they were also sex workers. So even within the LGBT movement of today, which has become a lot more mainstream, there's still people that point to these women and kind of say, like, hey, these are the roots of our movement, and, you know, how is that going to inform how we move forward? Another thing I just want to say about remembering histories is that sometimes learning about our histories requires realizing that we come from a lineage of people who were agents of oppression or violence. And this is something that we have to reckon with, which I believe is necessary to being an ally. But I also think that there's a lot to gain personally from that process. And we can keep talking about that. This one is Fighting Against Stigma in Search of Healing. This is also really powerful. I'm not going to say much here because this movement received a lot of national attention compared to others. So I think it's pretty easy to understand, and we all saw how that played out. And this is the founder of the movement. Okay, so in conclusion, I want to say that when individuals take ownership of their stories, it can be really transformative and powerful. A person might gain compassion for self, a language to articulate and honor their experiences, a sense of ownership over those experiences, an awakening to injustices committed against them, etc., etc. But when we practice these techniques in community, we make connections. We gain a sense of belonging, an identity perhaps, righteous anger, hopefully love for ourselves and for our community. And so that transformation extends beyond us as individuals and has the ability to move the masses. And yeah, so these were just a few examples of how narrative is essential to social justice.
Okay, so I'm going to finish off this video by discussing a little bit more in depth about some of the interventions that we have listed on the handout. So the first one that we're going to talk about is going to be the normalizing and strengthening intervention. The role of the social worker here is to encourage the client how they understand and approach the problem. It's important for the social worker to help the client externalize the problem so that their self-image is not affected by the problem. There's a quote by Michael White who's really centered around the narrative theory that goes, "The person is not the problem is the problem." So helping the client understand that they are not the problem, but the problem is the problem really helps them during this process. The social worker should avoid engaging in linear problem solving, but really focus on solution focused questions. Asking these kinds of questions can help outline their strengths that maybe the client didn't even know that they had. And by using active listening skills, the social worker can ask the client to describe other challenges related to the problem, how they're being managed, as well as sharing what their priorities and values are in life. So the next step in the intervention process is going to be the deconstruction or the reconstruction intervention. So the role of a social worker here is to help them understand and break down the ideas and the assumptions about themselves, the world, and how things should be, and deconstruct those notions about themselves or how things should be, and help them open up to new possibilities. The intervention emphasizes the client's awareness of how social conditions and power relationships give into the assumptions that the client has about themselves. Now, by doing this, this really helps the client understand where some of those assumptions that they have about themselves are coming from. Now, after the deconstruction comes, obviously, the reconstruction. So when the client has deconstructed those assumptions about themselves, they can begin to reconstruct a new narrative according to their new personal goals. So the last step in the intervention process is going to be the celebrating and the connecting intervention. So after the reconstruction has happened, they're going to have this new sense of self. Now, after this has happened, there's going to be 3 different phases in the celebrating and connecting intervention. So the first phase is going to be the consultation phase. So in the consultation phase, the social worker has reflective conversations or tasks with the client to help them develop new narratives. This can be accomplished by sharing therapy notes, audio or videotapes of sessions, or written materials from the client. Now, the next phase is going to be the personal declaration phase, and this is where the client shares their new narrative with significant others or people most important to them. The client may also join clubs or volunteer with organizations that support their new narrative. And then the last phase is going to be in the celebration phase. It's the time to celebrate the client's journey to their new narrative. This can look like a ceremony or can include prizes or awards, and that really works mostly with children, but it can also work with your client. Your adult client. The social worker may or may not be an active participant in the celebration process. And in that celebration phase, ending is the natural next step after celebration. And that's all, folks. Thanks so much for hanging in there. See you soon.